Hello everyone, I hope that your day is going really well. My name's Marina Dixon. I work at the Australian Childhood Foundation and it's time for one of our webinar series. This one's looking at practice strategies, and practice being the acronym that if you have done the online training, Trauma Responsive Practice in Education, you would have worked through. But we just thought it might be worth spending a bit of time just chatting about the practice framework, what it is, looking at it in a little bit more detail, because what we're really aware of is that as educators, you're always looking for strategies. How do we apply an understanding of trauma responsive practice in action? And that's what this session is really aiming to do. So we're going to have a look at the practice framework, as I say, in a bit of detail, and hopefully that will be helpful in terms of adding to your knowledge about trauma responsive practice. So before we get going though, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet today. And for, of course, the Canberra ACT community, that's the Ngunnawal people. I want to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and people who've seen any of my webinars previously will know that I always acknowledge those emerging elders, because that's who we work with when we're working with children, particularly the young children that we work with. We're thinking about who are they going to be in their community into the future, and who are they going to be as elders, and how can we support them to be leaders in their community, or at least to have a quiet strength within that community that they can share with other generations. So it's really making that acknowledgement of those community members and the wisdom that has come through the generations and continues into generations into the future. I also want to just remind you about this program as a whole. Again, if this is not your first webinar, then you will already know this, but just to clarify that this is part of the Early Childhood Education and Care Trauma-Informed Training Program, and particularly supporting those of you working with 3-year-olds, but all children in the early learning sector. It's a partnership between the Australian Childhood Foundation and the Education Directorate of the ACT, and it has a number of elements to it. This webinar series is just one of those components. The online training is another of those components, and then equally we also have our practice networks, our reflective practice networks, and they're really about supporting you in your practice and thinking around how to integrate trauma responsive practice into what you already do. I think that's one of the things that we often talk about, that this isn't about having to change everything you do, but it's really around thinking about how can I do what I do in a more trauma responsive way, because I can never quite fully know the stories of the children in my centre or at my site. And so how is it that I can be supportive? And one of the things that we always talk about with trauma responsive practices generally is that they're pretty much not harmful if you haven't experienced trauma. A lot of them are what we would call just good practice. And so it's helpful for all children. And again, that's what we'll have a look at in this session. So let's have a look at the practice framework. It's as we've said, sorry about that cough. As we've said, it's an acronym, so it stands for a number of elements, and that's what we're going to go through through this session. But really, why we've put it together is just as a way of thinking about how do we consider strategies and activities to best meet the needs of children, and particularly children who have experienced relational or developmental trauma. So it's grounded in that understanding. So this session assumes that you have an understanding of neurobiology, how the brain works and the brain and body connects, and of trauma and what it is and what it does, those impacts. And really this is about, okay, if we know that, where to from here? What else can we do? When we're looking at the practice framework as a whole, we would talk about the fact that you can use these strategies in a range of ways. So you can use it with individual children, thinking about how can I apply this for each unique child. We can use it in the groups, so in each room or each group, depending on how your centre is structured. There's certainly activities that we can use in that sort of group setting, or across the whole service or centre, because again, one of the things that we'll talk about and we continue to talk about is the importance of repetition and consistency. And so thinking around, okay, what are the things that are really important to us as a staff team that we want to implement across the whole centre? And so making those conscious choices about things that we might do. Is it, for example, how we greet children in the morning? Even if they're not in our room, how do we say hello? If we think about how do we manage transitions from inside to outside playtime, and does that happen across the rooms? You know, is there connection at that time? How do we manage that connection? So these are the sorts of things that we can consider when we're thinking about whole of service or whole of site. And I'm equally aware for some of you that whole of service might be the one group. So it's applicable regardless of the size of where you work and regardless of the number of children with which you work. It's also a reminder, I suppose, because when we're talking about practice, it just is that reminder around how is it that we learn new things? How is it that we gain new skills? We practice them. And really, what does practice mean? Practice means repetition. We do things regularly or consistently or repeatedly to be able to learn new things. And that starts when we're in early childhood and it continues for when we're adults as well. So this notion of practice can be a useful one around what is it that I need the children that I care for to practice on a daily basis, and how can I provide that when thinking about a trauma responsive approach. And the other thing about practice and the framework as a whole is that there are 8 elements within it, and all elements may not be relevant to all children. I would argue that some of them are pretty much consistent for all kids, but there are some where it may be that they have more relevance or less. And so it's not about saying you have to do each one or you have to do it in sequence. It's just about saying these are the areas of our time and our strategies and our activities within the learning context that we want to focus on, because those in themselves have a reparative purpose and they can have a reparative outcome as well for children. That this is what can enable change. This is what can enable, you know, reducing or mitigating the impacts of particularly relational trauma or developmental trauma. And so how is it that we can best meet the needs of each child? Which of these elements of the practice framework are most useful? There actually is another webinar session around using an audit tool. And so that's a way of using practice and thinking about sort of an audit process, not a formal audit or a quality audit or anything like that, don't worry. But it's just about doing a review of what you already do, what's already in place, what can you strengthen and what can you do differently. And so if you are interested, have a look for that webinar as well, because you might find that valuable in conjunction with this one. So thinking about all of those elements, sometimes they're all going to apply for a child or a group, sometimes only some of them. And sometimes just the reality of practice, pardon the pun, is that you can't put them all in place at the same time. So which are the ones that are most important? So what we're going to do is go through each of the elements in a consistent way. So what we're going to do is have a look first at what the element is and why is it important in the context of trauma responsive practice. And so the first one is P for predictable. So we'll have a look at why is it that we think predictability is important when we're thinking about trauma responsive practice. Then, just as an example, we'll then look at how. So then we start to look at those strategies. How do you implement predictable as an element of the practice framework? What are the sorts of strategies and activities that we can provide within the centre, within the service, that enables us to put that into place? And then we're going to talk about, or then we do a bonus one, but then it's like, well, what does that then look like? What happens? And so what we'll do is we'll unpack each of the 8 elements in that way by asking why, how, and what happens. Okay, so that's the structure. And that then means you know where you are in the session and you know when you might want to have a break, because I know an hour doesn't seem like a long time, but it can drag on a bit. So feel free to break at any time. So let's go back. Let's start with predictable. It's the first element in the framework because it starts with P. So it just fits really. But why is it that we talk about predictability as being important? Why is that part of trauma responsive practice? One of the things that we know is that kids who've experienced trauma struggle with change, because what change does is induces a threat response. And what we know is that trauma is an experience of threat, yeah, particularly threat to survival. And so what we see with children who've experienced trauma is that they're easily pushed into that threat state because they've had to be in a threat response state regularly because of their experiences. Now, we say that, and people will nod and go, yep, children who experience trauma often struggle with change. Yep, okay. But then you go, yeah, not sure it's just children who've experienced trauma who struggle with change, because actually, for all of us, change is experienced as a threat. And if you think about your own life, you think about the fact that, yeah, change can be quite threatening, and we can have some interesting reactions to that about how we respond and how we try to avoid change. And so it's not just the children that we work with who experience change as threatening. We all do. But for kids who've experienced threat on a daily basis because of trauma, it's particularly threatening when things change. So we want to build an air of predictability for them so that then they can feel safe. They feel safe in the knowledge that what happens here is predictable, it's consistent. I know what to expect. I don't have to be scanning all the time to see where the next threat might be coming from. So it's really important to think about how we build predictability into the everyday. And in early childhood, of course, we do that really well. And I think that's part of, again, what I say in terms of practice generally is often it's a reinforcement of what you're already doing, but it answers that question of why. Why does it work? And what's really interesting is because people will say, oh, well, you know, the only constant in life is change. You have to learn to deal with change. And that's true. Absolutely. That's absolutely true. But you actually need predictability to help you build a platform for managing change. So if you think about managing change, you kind of want to know that you're on solid ground, because that then helps you navigate change. So whereas if you're on a rocky platform, on a fragile platform, on wobbly ground, if you want to put it that way, it's really hard then to deal with a change because you're already feeling unsettled. So it's kind of counterintuitive to say the more consistent we can make the environment, the better able kids are to manage change. That seems really weird, but it's giving them that solid foundation. And from there, they feel like they can leap off into this new circumstance, this new situation, because they feel grounded. They feel like there's some solidity to their world. And so what we want to do is find a way to build that for them. And oftentimes, you know, in the early childhood education setting, you're going to be providing that predictability in a way that perhaps can't be done at home. And so what the child comes to see is that this is my place of predictability. This is my place of safety. This is my place of consistency and knowing what to expect from the world. And so it's really important we're able to provide that. And so really when we think about, well, what is predictability? It comes through routines, it comes through consistency. And the other thing is preparing kids for what's coming up next. I think that's often an important one, giving them that opportunity to make the adjustment, to make the shift, and doing that in consistent ways as well. So let's have a look at how. How are the ways that we can be predictable, and what strategies and activities can we build into the everyday? So building routines into each day is really important. This is how we enter the centre. This is what we do when we first get here. This is what we do when we come into the room. This is what we do when we say hello to people. This is what we do first each day. This is what we do second each day. This is, you know, how the day is structured. This is when we eat. This is when we rest, all those sorts of things, and being really clear about that. So again, you guys do this, but I think it's just reminding ourselves about why it's really critical. And is there a way that we can strengthen the routines in our centre or in our room? Because that will help the child feel safer. The other thing then is that notion around, even though we know what's coming up next because we're really consistent and predictable, we still need to prepare kids for that change. Often it's that point of transition that you see the most challenging behaviours, yeah? Particularly the transition I find from indoor to outdoor play. Often that's a real challenge, and that's where you can see, you know, punching and kicking and things start happening. And so what we want to do is help kids prepare for what's coming up next. So we want to use that sort of 5-minute changeover time, not calling it a 5-minute warning. Warning has a notion of threat to it. This is something we want to do. So it's our 5-minute changeover, or it's our 5-minute time to move, or it's our, you know, whatever language you want to use for that. And the kids might have their own ideas, but it's giving them that opportunity to adjust, to prepare for what's happening, to find a way to regulate. Do they need to move towards you to be able to regulate that change? That actually this is a child where you can't say, hey everyone, time to go outside, because that just throws them. They need time to come up to you and maybe hold your hand to be able to go outside with you. So you need to give them that time to make that adjustment, to find the strategy that works for them, and to help them find that strategy sometimes, because they're not necessarily going to know, but prepare them for what's coming up next. We do talk about visual timetables as well as a really good way of preparing kids for what's coming up next. The thing that I always reinforce, though, is that a visual timetable is only useful if you remember that there's a visual timetable to go and look at. And so sometimes what can happen is that we set them up and we know they're there and we talk to the kids about it, but forget to repeat the instruction about going to the visual timetable to look up what's going on. And I get that that kind of depends what time of year it is that you're watching this webinar, because if it's early in the year, you're more likely to be reminding the kids all the time about going to the visual timetable to look at what's coming up next. You might have the series of pictures that's showing them what they need to do and how they do that. And so you kind of remind them all the time. But by the time you get into the second term or third term, you've kind of forgotten that, because it's, you know, oh yeah, well, we're all used to that. What we would suggest from a trauma responsive approach is you kind of have to take the first couple of weeks way of doing it and apply it throughout the year. We can't just assume that children will remember. We know that one of the impacts of trauma is that it impacts memory. And so kids often struggle with remembering things from one day to the next. And again, that's not just traumatized children, but it's particularly exacerbated for them. So it's just thinking around, how can we utilize our visual timetables? We've put the effort into developing them. Let's make them useful. So it's just that reminder. So then the other thing, of course, is that planning is really helpful. So thinking about, how do we do transitions? What are the ways that we can do that? So where are the points of challenge? What do we use to make the transition? Do we use music? Do we use rhythm? Do we use movement? You know, that this is our time where we have to walk outside and we're all going to do this. I know it's an oldie, but it's a useful one, keeps hands engaged, but it's also a physical reminder. Do we use colour? You know, it's time to take out, you know, move in a green way, or whatever it might be. So how do we do transitions, and where are the points of challenge? Because we might want to use breathing as a way to manage a transition if we know it's a challenging one. So we might say, okay, so we're going to change activities. What we need to do now is do our move and breathe. So let's breathe in and take a step, breathe out. Right, let's breathe in and take a step, breathe out. 1 or 2 steps, whatever it might be. But what we're trying to do is use regulation at the same time as manage the transition. And we use this consistently so kids know when we're moving from this activity to this activity, or this space to this space, this is our time for calm. So it helps to support that. There may be other times where we do ramp it up a bit. We do use rhythm and we're marching out to doing this and we're doing it in that because the kids can tolerate it. So it's just finding different ways to navigate those transitions and identifying where are the points of most challenge, because it will be different for everyone. It'll be different for each centre as well, because also you'll have different bottleneck points. So how do we do that? And the other thing to hang on to when we're thinking about predictability is also plenty of information and time in the build up to important days or really big sort of days, even if they're positive. Just because they're positive doesn't mean that kids will have a positive response, because they can get easily overwhelmed by their own excitement. We often talk about this, and we will look at this later on when we're looking at some of the feelings-based elements of practice. But the physiology of feelings can be overwhelming for kids. And if you think about excited and scared, that's the easiest example. When you think about the physiology of excitement and the physiology of being scared, they're very similar. It's just the context that's different. So if I'm a child who's experienced being terrified or frightened or scared or whatever you want to call it regularly, and then, you know, it's grandparent day or something, and I'm really excited about grandparents coming, my physiology is the same as when I'm terrified. So my body reacts to that feeling as if I'm terrified rather than being excited. And so things where you go, well, I really thought they'd love this, but they've gone off their nut, that's the technical term, right, is often because they've been overwhelmed by their excitement, because it's kind of been interpreted as an overwhelming threat. So we need to give them lots of time to build up to the idea of something positive, which sounds really sad, but it's worth the effort, because you don't want it to be ruined for that child because they have to go home, or they miss out because they've got out of control in that moment. So it's that sort of process. So these are the sorts of things that we put into place when we're thinking about predictability. And so this is just a picture because it's pretty, just around thinking about using visuals, because again, we don't just want to use words, because sometimes words aren't valuable at points of crisis because kids can't actually understand what we're saying. Again, it's one of those impacts of being in a threat state, is that we lose the capacity to comprehend words. So sometimes visuals can be really useful. So this is just a reminder about why visuals are helpful. So that's very lovely, I'm sure. And so what happens for kids if we put this into place? One of the big things is they come to see you as a safe resource to help them. So they start to believe that adults can be helpful to them navigating and surviving in their world. And that's a really important thing. If my other experiences of adults is that they're not positive and they're not helpful. So by us being consistently available, consistent in how we say good morning, consistent in how we say goodbye, consistent in our interactions with them, then they start to see, hey, this person is someone who is safe and who I can utilize at times of change. And so it can be really tiny, that it could be something as simple as, you know, someone comes into the room unexpectedly, you know, a parent comes in or a visitor or whatever. And what you often see at the start is that that child will use any means to deal with that change. And often those any means are really unhelpful. So they might bolt out of the room, or they'll punch the kid next to them, or they'll go and dive under the table. You know that you've made a change when, if that person comes into the room, the child looks at you or comes towards you, right? Because that then means I see you as a resource. You can help me navigate this change. Whereas in the past, I felt like I had to do it myself, okay? And that's massive, but it's tiny. So it's understanding that some of the changes that we'll see in the children may be really small, but in the context of their world, they're huge. So it's just that reminder about children coming to see you as a safe resource. Clearly, what then happens is you get less volatile responses to change, and that's a good thing for everyone. So we want kids to be able to navigate those changes because there's a consistent platform. And the other thing is that then they go back to learning how to navigate change by themselves by using less volatile means. So they might use their breathing, they might use their marching, they might hum to themselves, or they might use you as a resource or their peers. So it shows you that there is change and there is movement. So that's the first element. We probably need to be a bit quicker with the other ones. We'll see how we go. This is a big one though. Responsive. What are we talking about with being responsive? So this is about how we respond to children's behaviour, right? So we want to be responsive to the meaning behind the behaviour. That's what we're saying. So it's that question of what do you need rather than what are you doing? And so we need to respond to kids' behaviour from a starting point of trying to understand the meaning behind the behaviour, because our responses can either escalate things or de-escalate. And clearly what we're looking for is a de-escalation. The other thing that we want to do in our responses to behaviour is to help kids internalise rules and consequences. And I've put here or whatever language we use, because that's the other side of it. Do we want to talk about rules and consequences? Do we want to talk about things to do and what happens when you don't, or things to do and what happens when you do? Like, do we want to put a positive spin on it? How is it that we talk about, we might have expectations and consequences? Because I think consequences gets a bit of a bad rap, because you can have positive consequences. It's just the outcome of the thing. It can be good, bad, or ugly, but I think it kind of gets seen as a consequence is a bad thing, and that's not the case. So why we're saying all of that is that kids who've experienced trauma often struggle with understanding rules and consequences, because they have, again, it goes back to the other one about predictability and consistency. They haven't experienced a consistent response to their behaviour. So often it is that they can do A and B will follow, but then the next day they can do A and C will follow, and the next day they can do A and D will follow. So they kind of don't learn that their behaviour influences the outcome, because the outcome is always different, even though they're doing the same thing. So we see this in traumatizing relationships, that there's an inconsistency of response. So kids, again, don't know where they stand. So with us responding from what the child needs rather than what they're telling us with what they're sort of showing us with their behaviour, it then helps them to learn what's okay and what's not. We need to help them understand what's okay and what's not, because if no one's told you something isn't okay, how do you automatically know? So it's that thinking around how do we respond to children's behaviour. So unfortunately, when we're thinking about strategies and activities, the first one there isn't about the kids at all, it's about us. So we have to keep asking ourselves, what might this behaviour mean? Does this mean that, and we do that automatically, actually. Like if you think about babies, we're doing it all the time because they can't tell us. And so we're kind of second guessing all the time, aren't we? Oh, is that her, I'm wet cry? Or is that the I'm hungry cry? Or is that the, I'm feeling scared and I need to be picked up cry? Like we're trying to understand what that behavior means. And that's the same behavior. That's just the crying, quite apart from other things that occur. So we do it with little ones, but as they get older, we sort of stop asking that question and we kind of go, well, you need to tell me, use your words. And it's like, yeah, okay, but if I'm a child who's experienced trauma, I'm really not going to be able to say, oh my goodness, well, I've actually experienced a trauma trigger here. There's something in this room that smells like the house where my grandfather abused me, and that's reminding me of the abuse that I've experienced, and so that's triggered that response, and I'm feeling really scared and terrified, and I need you to help me. They're not going to do that. They can't do that. And so for us, we need to keep understanding what this child's behaviour might mean. And trauma triggers is a really good example, that it might be that their experience has been triggered and they're reacting as if it's happening in the moment. And so we don't know what the trigger is necessarily, but what we can do is try and track the behavior and look for patterns. You know, does this always happen in the morning? Does it always happen in the afternoon? Does it always happen when someone comes into the room, you know, a particular person? Does it always happen in that room but not that room? So what's different there? Is the carpet different, or is the smell different? It's really hard to tell. But it's just trying to understand, what is this behavior trying to tell me? Is it trying to tell me the child's overwhelmed? Is it trying to tell me that they're terrified? Is it trying to tell me that that they just don't know how to regulate their own responses? Is it trying to tell me that they really just need me to be there with them, that they really feel so terrified and they just want someone to be there for them? So we just have to keep asking ourselves, what are they trying to tell me? They're not trying to piss me off. That's the professional term. They're not trying to manipulate me. I think that's always an interesting one as well. It's very hard for a 3-year-old to manipulate someone because it requires a really highly developed prefrontal cortex. And we know that the prefrontal cortex is not highly developed at 3 years old. So they're not trying to manipulate me. They're just trying to survive or get something that they feel like they need. You know, they're limbically controlled. They're controlled by their emotions. You know, I feel like I'm going to die if I don't have chocolate, you know, that sort of thing, which is a bit facetious, but it's kind of that intensity of response. So what is it they're trying to tell me? And then we want to separate the child from their behavior. Now, again, I know that you guys know this. So it's just that reminder, because what we're saying is that behavior is not okay, but you are. And I'm hanging in there with you. You know, it's that message around, I'm not going to abandon you like other people have. I'm not going to withdraw from you like other people have. I'm hanging in there with you because I think you're worth it. So how is it that we can communicate that message? Yes, we can do it in words, but we need to do it in actions as well. And so this is where we start thinking around different ways of responding to behaviour. And the clear example we talk about is time in, not time out. Time out, you know, you need to go away from me, you need to go and sit in the calm corner or whatever, is fine if my experience of relationships has been positive, because it then says, okay, so I'm going over there because of my behavior. I get that this is because of my behavior because I know this person actually really likes me. They have a connection. Now, they may not be able to articulate it quite as clearly as that, but that's the message that they carry with them. But if you're a child who's experienced abandonment and withdrawal of affection, then if someone says you need to go over there because, you know, you need to calm down, all I hear is get away from me, right? So it's because it becomes about me. It's not about my behavior. It's about me being worthless and being abandoned. So that's why time out doesn't tend to work with kids who've experienced trauma, whereas time in says that behavior is not okay. You need to come and stand next to me for 5 minutes, right? So I am still here with you. We are still connected. Always say you might want to stay about a leg distance apart. But it's very interesting because kids often won't attack you while they're doing, you know, while they're in that time in space, because it's meeting their need. They need to feel connected, even though their behavior is not okay. So it's still saying, giving a clear message, you can't do that, but I'm staying with you and you're staying with me, and we'll keep going afterwards. You know, I'm not abandoning you. I'm not going to berate you for the 5 minutes that you're standing there telling you what a little piece of crap you are. I'm just going to be there and then say, okay, you know, that here we don't do whatever the behavior is. But I'm really glad that you stayed next to me for that time, and now you can go if you want, or you can stay for a bit longer. So it's that kind of process. So that moves into that next point around reinforcing the rules during times of low stress. There's no point telling a child when they're in that elevated state about what the rules are, because they're not comprehending the words that you're saying. And again, I know that you know that, but you know, the language that we would talk about with trauma responsive practice is we need to talk to the child about what's expected when they're in their window of tolerance. So when they're in that calm state, because that's when they can tune into human voices. That's when they can best understand what you're saying. And that's when they're calm. That's also when they're best able to learn, of course. And really, this is about learning, isn't it? It's about learning what behavior is okay and what's not. So we want to do that later on. There's no point doing it in the moment. So we use responses that reinforce the relationship rather than removing it. So I'm staying connected to you, but I need to give you a message about your behavior. So I'm not going to send you away. I'm going to ask you to stay with me, even though your behavior is not okay. The other thing we need to do, and this is the flip side of behavior, is help the child see when they've done well. You can't just assume that they know they're doing the right thing. So we really need to do, and again, you know this, we talk about this, we've got to praise positive behavior because otherwise kids don't learn. They often need to process the positive as much as they need to process the negative. That's the frames that we would put on it. So helping them understand what they've done well, why they've done it, and what that means for them, because here's another opportunity to show a consequence doesn't have to be negative. A consequence is positive as well. It's an outcome. The other thing that we often talk about in terms of being responsive is also building a script for responding. And this is one that where it's really helpful if it's consistent across the service or the centre. And when we say a script, it's not about, you know, reading something out when the child is doing something like, you can't do this here, that's not what we do. But it's just things like, what words should you use with this child if their behaviour is escalating, and what words should you avoid? The example that I often use is whether you use a child's name or not, or another one is whether you call them mate or not. That's probably for older kids, but younger ones as well. So if you think there are some kids where their behaviour might be escalating and you say, oh, Joel, like you just need to calm down, yeah? And that helps them. Whereas there are other kids where you say, oh, Joel, and they go, and because you've used their name, then they kind of have a reaction to that. The same with mate, you know, oh, mate, you just need to calm down. I'm not your effing mate, blah, 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 yeah? Whereas other kids, when you say, hey, mate, come on, let's go and do this thing instead, then they're like, oh, okay, because they really like that. So what are the words to use? And so the other one might be, you know, that for some kids you can say, hey, stop mucking around. Whereas if you say mucking around to another kid, they really don't like it. So I'm using the word kid a lot today. My apologies, child. And so thinking about the words. So there's words, and then the other one is gestures. So, and particularly the use of touch. Because the example that I always talk about is that you will know there are some children where if their behaviour is escalating and you want to regulate it, if you just put your hand gently on their shoulder, it actually helps them calm down because it kind of works as a regulator. But equally, there are other children, where if you put your hand on their shoulder, they will escalate even quicker. So having that information so it's consistent across the staff team is really helpful, because then if I'm in another room but I come across this child who is starting to escalate and I notice that, I kind of have a sense of how to respond, and I'm not going to put my foot in it and make it worse because I didn't know about what this child needs and what works and what doesn't. So having that information, sharing that information with each other is really helpful. So these are the sorts of ways that we look at responding to behaviour. So that's the how. And then what happens? Children experience that consistency of response to their behaviour. So they know that B always follows A. So if I do this, this is what happens today. If I do this, this is what happens tomorrow. It happens next week. It happens next month. It happens every time. It happens at the start of the day, happens at the end of the day. And they start to come to experience that as consistent again and safe. That then enables them to internalize those behavioral expectations. So I don't need external reinforcement all the time because I've come to see that B always follows A. So I can hold that's what happens, and that's for the good as well as the negative. Again, it's a consistent theme, isn't it? That children experience the team as affirming and as consistent and as helpful, not as scary and abandoning and withdrawing and treating them like they're worthless, which often has been their relational experience. And you can see that children can adjust their behaviour to the expectations of the centre. That may not be how they behave at home, but they understand that here, this is the expectation, and here, this is what we do, and here, this is what happens on Monday, Friday, Wednesday, whatever day it is. And so they can differentiate between the different environments rather than having one gear regardless of where they are. So that's responsive. Our second element. Attuned. What's this one about? So this is around feelings, and we know that kids who've experienced trauma often they don't know how they feel. There's a disconnect between their feelings and their bodies and their feelings and their thoughts. And often they haven't had people recognize their feelings. You know, they've been ignored, or their feelings have been ignored. And so they don't know how they feel, which sounds bizarre, but they don't have that connection. And so they kind of experience feelings as separate from themselves. And they just need help to basically bring a cortical or conscious label to what's happening in their body. So they have all the physiology happening. They have all that tension, the fight or flight, you know, all the stuff that we talk about, but they kind of can't link all that subcortical, subconscious physiological experience to a label, to, you know, and whatever that label is. And that then makes it hard to regulate. So they need help in regulating their emotional responses. And we know that's how we learn, isn't it? That we learn self-regulation through co-regulation. So if I haven't had an experience of co-regulation on a consistent basis, then I'm not going to be able to regulate myself. So how can we provide that in what we do? So how do we do that? Oh, let's push that again. Try a different, there we go. Oh, now we've gone too far. So how do we do that? So we want to reflect back the child's emotional state and what the physiology is that's connected to that. And again, in early childhood educators are really good at this. If I go and talk to high school teachers about this stuff, they're not necessarily very good at this without making any assumptions. But you guys are. So it's just that reminder. So we want to, you know, your hands are looking like wiggly worms. Your legs seem to be having trouble staying still. I'm wondering if that means you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, you know. So we're trying to show them that there's a connection between what's happening in their body and how they're feeling, their emotional state. So we want to give words or another cortical label to the child's experience. So finding ways to help them. Now, why I say words or another cortical label is that often our focus is on building a feelings vocabulary. And when we say vocabulary, we mean it literally, like words. I'm happy, sad, angry, surprised, scared, you know, and then we start to expand it out. You know, am I gleeful? Am I excited? Am I overwhelmed? You know, this sort of stuff. That's great, but for some children, it doesn't mean anything. And that doesn't matter. They don't necessarily need the words. They just need a way of being able to articulate consciously how they're feeling. So the cortical label could be a color. I am feeling blue, pardon the pun. I'm feeling green. I'm feeling yellow. I'm feeling red. I'm feeling orange. Whatever that might be, it doesn't matter. But what we're trying to do is help that child to be able to say, when I'm feeling red, this is what's happening in my body. When I'm feeling green, this is what's happening in my body. Because then we go into this idea about intensity of feeling as well. So if I'm feeling green, do I like feeling green, right? If I like feeling green, then how can I make it more intense? How can I get a deeper shade of green? You know, so we can start to do that sort of regulation. We might link it to music. You know, I'm feeling whatever it is. I'm feeling like the Wiggles today, whereas I'm feeling like Bluey singing today or whatever. And I link the piece of music to that feeling. Now, depending on what that feeling is, then it comes, how do I turn up the volume? How do I turn down the volume? I might link it to the texture You know, I'm feeling rough today. I'm feeling smooth today. I'm feeling scrunchy today. I'm feeling crinkly today. Doesn't matter what that is. Do I need to feel more crinkled? Do I need to crinkle it even more? Or do I need to smooth it out more because I really like it? So it's finding ways, because all we're trying to do is give a conscious cortical label to the physiology, the subcortical experience, because then I start to help myself to understand how I'm feeling, whether I like it, and how I can then regulate it. How can I blow up this feeling to a bigger feeling? We sometimes use balloons as well. So I'm feeling blue. This is a blue balloon. How big is the balloon, right? And I blow it up, blow it up. Okay, do I want to let the air out of my feeling, or do I want to put some more air in? Yep. So we start to find ways to build that language. The other thing that we want to do in terms of us being attuned to the child is track their emotional state during the day. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier around trauma triggers, that it's useful to track them to see if we can find any patterns, because then we know this child needs support with regulation at particular times of the day, or, you know, when we're doing particular activities. We're not sure why, but something, something sets them off at this time or during this activity. Not quite sure what it is. They don't know either, but we know that they need extra support with regulation. And that makes the day a bit easier if we don't have the explosion. So we're exploring the intensity of feelings as much as the labels. And we're playing lots of feelings games as well. So feelings bingo, which is what this can be. It's a really bad example, but because with younger kids, you're not going to have that many faces, but just circle 3 feelings that you've had today. Let's match them. That's a learning experience as well. That helps with corpus callosum. And so then when I've circled my 3 and I cross them off, then I'm bingo, bloody blah. That's all it is. Feeling charades, clearly acting out a feeling. What word would we give to this feeling, or what color, what music, whatever, what is it? Or the alphabet of feelings as well. So we might start to do the alphabet if you want to do words linked to feelings. The other one is past the face. That's quite fun as well, where it's like Chinese whispers, but with facial expressions or with a feeling. So you sort of show the next kid along, they then tap the next child in front of them, they show them the face, and you see if it changes as you go down the line. And like that sort of game around passing on the whisper, it tends to change from one end to the other. So it's just a nice way of sort of continually moving those ideas around feelings on. I know you will have thousands of other ideas as well, but we're thinking around, we want to reflect back their emotional state. We want to track their feelings. We want to help them to link physiology with cortical label, and to think about the intensity of feelings as much as the type of feeling. These are the principles, and the activities are many and varied. And so what happens? Clearly, then they're able to make that connection between internal state with external label. When we think about a trauma responsive approach, the reason for that is we're kind of trying to build the child's vocabulary to give them a way of processing the feelings that are associated with the trauma. So this will help them to connect experiences of the past with their feelings in the present. It's almost the other way around. It's around connecting feelings in the present with what happened in the past, to then be able to process some of that. Don't even have to go anywhere near talking about what happened, but about regulating the feeling, understanding what the feeling is. Did I like it? Did I not? How can I make it go away? Not go away, but how can I bring it down or amp it up, or whatever language we use. Equally, it also says that all feelings are okay, which is that important message. So we continue to experience emotions as being validated, which is really important if I've had my feelings ignored through my life. And we can work together to try and find those patterns of possible triggers. And if you can kind of preempt a trigger, even if you don't know what it is, that makes the day run a bit more smoothly as well. So it has multiple benefits. So that's our attuned. it's interesting because attuned and connecting really link to each other, because this is about building even more capacity for children, because really attuned is predominantly attuned is about how we understand the child's physiology. We're noticing it, we're tracking it, we're helping them to make the connection. Connecting is about helping them then to make the links as well for themselves and strengthening that linking capacity. So it's understanding how they're feeling, for them to understand how they are feeling, what they're feeling, and sometimes even how those feelings are linked to the past or the present. And that's sometimes what we would call emotional literacy. I think the challenge around the phrase emotional literacy is people tend to focus on words, and that's the bit that I keep sort of saying. Emotional literacy does not have to be about the language that we have. It's just around our understanding of what's happening and our emotional responses. And again, when we're connecting, we need to feel like our feelings are legitimate, and that other people are seeing the same thing, so children can learn to trust their own responses. Because if you think about abuse, some of the experiences of abuse, if someone's feeling scared, for example, because they're being sexually abused, but the person is telling them, this is love, you should enjoy this, right? But their body is saying, stop, I don't want this. Then what they'll learn is not to trust their own responses. I must be wrong. This adult is telling me I should be enjoying this and I'm not. So I'm sorry to use such a graphic example, but it tells you about what can happen for children in terms of them trusting their own responses. So what we're trying to help them do is reconnect their body, their cortical understanding, and find ways of linking that. Now, for younger children, it may not have the complexity of thought or analysis that goes along with it, but we can certainly legitimize their feelings. We can make a fuss when they get hurt, for example, because often that's the other one. Children who've experienced physical abuse may hurt themselves in the playground, and they won't show that they're hurt because they've learnt, do not show pain, don't show that you are hurt. So they kind of need us to make a fuss of them when they fall over, to say it's okay to be hurt, and we're really sorry that this has happened and that you've got a scrape on your knee. That's really awful, and here, can I help you with it? I'll put a band-aid on it, or something like that. So it's helping them to say it's okay to experience hurt, it's okay to experience pain. I will legitimize that feeling because it's more than reasonable for you to have it. So it's that kind of process that's helping them reconnect those feelings. Got a bit deep and meaningful there, but this is what we need. So the other thing then, the flip side of that is, if that's my world, going back to what I said earlier around then what happens with something like excitement. So we need to help children to experience positive feelings as well, and to legitimize those, like, oh, it's so great that you're so excited, that's so fantastic, I love seeing your wonderful smile, those sorts of things. I wonder if this is about feeling really happy. I wonder if this is about feeling really pink, or whatever it might be, whatever language. So we have to help them to understand those positive experiences as well, and even sometimes do that link around, oh, I can see that you're a bit wiggly, but it's a different wiggly, isn't it? Because it's not scary wiggly, it's a different wiggly, isn't it? So we're just trying to help them to link that. So again, we're continuing to build that vocabulary for the child's feelings, and looking for a cortical label for subcortical experience. I've put the colour chart here because that's a lovely way of doing it. Because, again, as I was saying, around looking at the intensity of the feeling. So not just the fact that we're yellow, but what's the intensity of the yellow? And do I want to go up that chart or down that chart, depending on how kids define what that might be. We can use physical activities as well as that emotional release, because we know so much of our emotions is physiology. And so we need that emotional release all of us do. You know, at the end of a crappy day ourselves, we need an emotional release that's often physical, about whether we go for a run, whether we have a bath, whether we just need to scream, you know, on the way, in the car on the way home, or put on a particular piece of music that we can yell at, you know, those sorts of things. We need that emotional release. So how do we help children to find that and connect that experience? And then, of course, we also want to legitimize those emotional states. And you can use that through discussion, you know, in storybooks, in movies or TV shows, because again, it's saying these are some of the things that they're thinking about this character, and this is what happens in this story. I'm wondering if everyone can think about that for themselves, you know, and that's okay. So it's really giving that legitimacy to however we respond. I know it's the cliche, all feelings are okay. It's what you do with them that might not be. But that's so true. And if you haven't had that experience at all, then it's very hard. So it's really about pulling together that connection between emotional state and how I experience that, and that's okay. So that's connecting. And then what happens? Clearly you help the child connect, so they've got that better capacity to link that internal state with the conscious cognitive process, and they trust in their own responses, which is helpful for them moving forward anyway, to trust their own experience and to trust that their response is okay. And that then helps them to feel safer in the learning environment as well, because you're hoping that when something's challenging, they can talk about it. And then we can talk about fun to feel scared, or what it means to be challenged by something, but that doesn't mean you have to run away from it. Like, there's a whole lot of stuff that comes out of that if you trust those emotional responses, and then what flows from that. So it supports that feeling of safety. So attuned and connecting are the two that really go together. So then we move into translating. So what's that about? So this is really about building stories of understanding. As I said earlier, and as we've talked about in some of the other sessions, trauma impacts memory. So often children struggle with that narrative memory, sort of putting together stories of understanding. So they need help with that. And that's what translating is about. So what we're trying to do is give them that continual opportunity to remember, to put together pieces of a picture, figuratively and literally. And also we go back to the consistency and repetition as well, around remembering events, experiences, and blocks of learning, to repeat that so that then they can put it with the next piece and put it with the next piece, rather than their memory being focused on being fragmented, which is really what trauma does. It tries to fragment memory rather than put memories together. So it's that sort of process that can be problematic. So we want to help kids in terms of building these stories of understanding, both of their own experience, but also in terms of their own learning. So how do we do that? It's continuing to review. So it's always going back and review, go back, review, go back, review, go back, review. We want that repetition of experience, whether that's what the child has done, or whether that's a piece of learning. So we know repetition is really important in learning. It's just kind of amping it up a little bit when we're thinking about trauma responsive practice. And then to help kids to review the story. What have you done today? You know, what did you do this morning? What did we do at lunchtime? What did we do now? And then when they come in tomorrow, we say, hey, what do you remember about yesterday? I remember blah, 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 blah. You know, so you're just trying to help them make those links and connections. And again, that's where consistency and predictability is really helpful, because then they kind of come to trust that they can rely on their memory, because what happened yesterday was the same as the day before. And so there's that consistency of experience. The other thing about building stories of understanding is this idea about creative activities that record children's memories and experiences of their time with you, basically, and their time in the room. So I know often you'll put together like folios of work, and that's great, because that becomes the record of the child's time with you. But I suppose the bit that we would add is just to review those folios regularly, to keep going back to them. You know, hey, let's have a look at your your, whatever you call it, your folio, your folder of work, your folder, whatever it is, let's have a look. Let's pull out this drawing. Do you remember when you did this drawing? And they'll be like, no. And you can say, I remember when you did this drawing, and you said that this was a drawing of, I don't know, a house and your dog, whatever. And you sort of said this was what you did on the weekend, that weekend, so, and then, because you might have written notes on the back of it. And so then you go back next week and you say, hey, let's look at your folio. Let's pull out this drawing. Do you remember what this drawing's of? And they might say, oh, it's a house. And do you remember why you drew that house and that dog? Oh, because that's what we did on the weekend, right? Doesn't happen quite that quickly, but it's that sort of repetition. So you can go back and look at it. Now, I know people will be saying, but aren't you telling the story? And it's like, well, yes, but I'm doing it with genuine intent, and it's based on the child's story and what they told me at the time. I'm not making crap up. I'm utilizing what the child told me at the time and going back to that. And that's the difference, that yes, I could make up stories, but that's not helpful for the child. What I want to do is remind them of what they told me at the time that they did that activity. So then we can go back and make that connection. And then you go, yeah, but isn't that suggesting? And it's like, well, yeah, a bit, but memory is suggestible. And I say the same thing to you, like, you might look at a photo, and it's a photo of your family at Christmas, and you'll say, oh yeah, I remember that Christmas. I remember when that was, because X and Y happened. And I'll kind of go, that's lovely, but do you actually remember that Christmas, or do you remember multiple Christmases, because that's what your family did at Christmas? And this photo is kind of the representation of the story of our family's Christmas. And that's not bad. It's just that experience of being able to pull together stories of understanding and put it all together, rather than having it as fragmented and having only pieces and snapshots. So this is happening at a time where children's memories are developing generally. But then if you've got a brain that's trying to work against you by fragmenting everything because of the trauma and the overwhelming nature of it, it's really problematic. So we kind of need to repeat the activities and strategies that we would do normally, but in a more intensive way for a child who's experienced trauma. The other thing is then about helping kids project themselves into the future, which I know is bizarre for a 3-year-old, but most 3-year-olds have a clear vision of what they're going to be when they grow up. Traumatized children often don't, because they don't see that they have a future. They're held captive to their past and their experiences of trauma. So what we can do is try and fill in the gaps about projecting them into the future and seeing what they can do, linking it to who we see them as today. And so giving them that sort of positive story of who we think they could be into the future, because we think they have one. So it's that sort of opportunity to do some of that lovely work around projecting them into the future. And the other thing that we want to do then also is just gently challenge some of the negative narratives that kids hold about themselves. And often that's been the abuser that has promoted that negative narrative. And it is interesting, because working with younger children, you're more likely to hear that negative narrative, because they're more likely to actually say it. When they're sitting in the sandpit and you'll hear the words come out and you think, oh, that's what their dad's been saying to them all the time. Like, you are such an idiot, you are such a loser, and they'll overt it. As kids get older, they tend to hide it and internalize it more. Younger kids, you'll tend to hear it. And so it's not about saying, oh, no, you're not, but it's just saying, oh, I'm sorry to hear that you're saying that about yourself. That's not how I see you. What I see is someone who's playing in the sand and doing a great job putting it into the cup, or, whatever it is. But it's just about gently challenging some of that, because you'll hear those words come out because the child has taken that on board. So how can we just gently challenge some of the stories they carry about themselves? And so that's translating is really about those stories of understanding, but it has a benefit for learning as well, because what we're also trying to do is help kids build better memory. and that will help them with being able to retain concepts as much as it is about their own experiences. So it's a learning capacity process as much as it is the child's own development and being trauma responsive. And so we want them to be able to engage with this positive sense of self as well, and that helps them move into the future with a sense of hope. So that story work is really critical to how we practice. And so then we take a deep breath. See, I told you this session you might need to do in a couple of bits. We're nearly there. We're probably going to go over an hour a bit, but hopefully that's okay. But feel free to pause at any time. But we're up to involving. In some ways, this is the one that we can do the least about, because involving is really about involving kids with their peers, because we know that children who've experienced trauma often are a bit isolated. So this is about really thinking about how can we involve them in activities with their peers. And I often say, like, if we can do that well, it's kind of like half our work's already done. You know, we don't need to do as much then, because they'll get what they need from their peers. But we have to provide those opportunities, because often they'll struggle with peer relationships. And if you think about it, that's the thing. If my focus is on surviving the day, then it's really hard to invest the energy in trying to connect with someone else and, you know, think about their feelings, all those social skills that we try and teach children, when all I'm trying to do is just survive. Like, I don't have energy for trying to form those connections, even if I want to. And often when I try to, I do it in ways that are unhelpful, because the other children don't understand, because this child can be different. And so they're not sure why they behave when they do. And if they're sometimes, you know, this traumatized child's behavior can be scary. Having said that, though, it is that remarkable thing about children and how they often will accept difference in others at this age, and how lovely that is. So that's why I say, if we can do that, then that's really great, because it enables us to kind of stand back and the children sort of manage that relational interaction. But we do need to do a bit of support with that. So when we're thinking about the how, I mean, a lot of it is what you already do, but I suppose it's just that reminder. What I often talk about is building groups around areas of interest rather than capacity. That's less relevant in early childhood in some ways. You know, it is about bringing together all the kids that barrack for Hawthorn, or all the kids that love trains, or all the kids that want to play, you know, play basketball. That's how they connect, rather than it being all the kids who struggle with social skills, which can sometimes happen. And as I say, in early childhood, that's probably not quite as relevant. You know, they're not separated. Whereas once they move into primary school, then it's often that they'll be sort of grouped according to kids who struggle with social skills, and that's not helpful. There's no point putting all the kids who struggle with social skills together, because they struggle with social skills. So it can be quite complicated. Whereas if they're all excited about talking about the footy on the weekend, then it's a great way of connecting without realising that you're connecting. Again, going back to what you guys already know, the developmental sequence of play, you know, how kids develop that capacity for play, and just remembering that chronologically they may be at an age where they're starting to look at cooperative play, but developmentally these children often aren't. So how can we enable them to do individual play, or parallel play, rather than expecting them to engage in cooperative play, which may be just a bridge too far if I'm in that sort of shut down survival state. So just thinking around how can we enable those opportunities, and that it's okay. Sometimes you can sit out an activity. Structured activities work better than unstructured time. You will know that yourselves. When do things go most awry? During unstructured time. So continually structuring activities, as much as it is a bit more work, it's worth it, because you'll see less blow-ups and it enables children to connect. And then that repetition of experience. This is what we do as a group on a daily basis, and we all do it regardless. So this is the expectation. These are the things we do. That then builds safety, and it also builds the capacity to, integrate, involve myself with my peers, because we're all doing the same thing. There's an expectation that we do the same thing, and we do the same thing every day. So we're kind of all in it together. So Again, it just reinforces what you're already doing, but it has really good benefits because the child starts to believe that they actually belong. They experience that sense of connection where a lot of their world has been about disconnection. And then they see what's okay and what's not. So they don't have to try inappropriate things to kind of make friends or, connect with people. So they'll do things that are more expected because that's what we do consistently and repeatedly. So it's a really lovely way of connecting. So that's that one. And it is funny in practice because we actually come to the most important ones at the end, but often we write this in a column. And so the E and the C are at the bottom. And we often talk about the fact that the E and the C are, as it says here, the foundational pillars of practice. So C is for calming, E is for engaging in appropriate adult-child relationships. I feel like we talk about these a lot. So it's just that reminder that children struggle with experiencing calm. Calm is our optimal state. It's optimal for learning, for connecting, for relating, for our physiology, for our capacity to think, for our capacity to be calm. So we want to help kids experience calm regularly and consistently. It is fundamental to trauma responsive practice. And equally, we say our reflective and our cognitive capacity is at its peak. So if we want kids to learn, they have to be in a calm state. You cannot learn if you are in an agitated, hyper-aroused, hypo-aroused, hyper-vigilant state. You need to be calm. So we really have to focus on finding what works for each child and that repertoire of calming strategies and activities that are consistently experienced. And so we go back to some of those things we've talked about throughout: drumming, music, physical activity, breathing, guided imagery even. Do we want to do mindfulness? Do we do colouring in consistently? So all those sorts of things that we know. Do we want to do nice nurturing activities like kneading bread, using hand sanitizer? Can actually be a nice one because you actually rub it on your hands, which can feel nice. But we have to make sure that it works for the child, because there may be some things that work for some kids. I often say one person's calm is another person's stress. If any of you have done the self-care session, you'll know that I talk about that in terms of like meditation. Because it's the other M as well, massage. Yeah. So some people love massage. They'll be like, oh yes, it's so calming. Whereas other people are like, oh, can't think of anything worse, having someone, I don't know, touching me. Oh my God. Yeah. The same with meditation. Oh, I love it. It just puts me in a different place. Whereas other people go, oh, can't stand it, hate shutting my eyes, don't want to do it. And so I just spend the whole time making a shopping list, right? Which can be a form of meditation, just quietly. But anyway, so we have to find out what works for the children, because it may be that we pick something that doesn't work for them in terms of calming, but then we provide it consistently and repeatedly, and it makes such a difference. Like, can't say how much difference it makes. But going back to the point around self-care, you can't yell at someone to calm down. So we have to look after ourselves. We have to use our own calming or self-care strategies to be able to do this work. It's not airy-fairy. It's not some abstract concept. It is fundamental and critical to practice that we look after ourselves. Cannot say it enough. And again, going back to that attuned and connecting, we also want to help children to associate what calm feels like with some sort of cortical label to help them go, oh, that's what this is. This is the state that I need to be in. You need to know what calm feels like to be able to access it. Because if I don't experience it a lot, I may not know what it is when I get there. So we need to help kids experience calm and know what it is as much as any other feeling. So you get that resetting, like they're not hypervigilant, they're less likely to respond in a volatile way. Clearly it's good for learning, feeling connected, engaging in relationships, and they're just lovely activities to do for everyone. It's not going to be harmful to other kids to do calming activities. Who knew? And so the last one is about relationships. And, you know, this is the theme that goes through every webinar, goes through the online training. It'll go through the Reflective Practice Network, because a network is about relationships. Relationships are fundamental. They are a healing tool. They are a therapeutic tool. They are critical to our survival. So they're essential. And so what our children need is repeated opportunities of positive relational exchanges with adults. Can't say it more clearly. We just have to use relationship, and we do, and we know it, and we just have to value it. I think that's the thing. So that relational exchange is so important. It's really hard to do the how for relationships, because how do I tell you guys how to do relationships? But I suppose it's just saying, what can be useful is identifying which children connect with who in the centre, and kind of, you know, making sure that there's that consistent opportunity for connection with that identified key adult for each of the children. But you need to share the load with that. Again, a consistency of response from all the adults across the centre is really good. We've talked about that a few times in this session. So what is it that we think is most important in terms of our interaction with all the children in our centre? What do we all need to do that best supports the children that we work with? So it's just having that conversation, and then supporting, you know, identified key adults. That's the other side of it, because this can be hard. So it is doing a bit of a tag team if you need to, on those days where you just go, oh my God, I need to do floristry, right? And just to be able to know that someone's got your back, and you can kind of tap out for a little while and then take a break, do some calming activities, and then come back. And that's okay. We've got here, remember, rupture and repair. That, you know, your relationship with the children doesn't have to be perfect. There will be ruptures, as there are with our own kids, but the critical thing and the different thing from what they've experienced is the repair afterwards. So it's that sort of coming back together and reconnecting and saying, hey, that sucked, but, you know, we're back together again, and I'm still hanging in there with you. I think you're great. You're worth it. You know, you are such a wonderful person, however you want to language that. So it's just that reminder. And why? Because it's just fundamental for children. So they learn that you can have different levels of relationship as well, which is really important. They feel safe. And, you know, that just that blanket statement around, from this safety, all other possibilities flow. If children feel safe in relationship, they can do anything. So, and we can do that. We can do that so easily. So it's just those little interactions on a daily basis are so critical. So let's finish there. There's the reflective questions as always. What would you add to these lists? Because this, you know, we said it's all strategies, but there's a lot of talk. So what do you already do? Which area of practice do you think you and your team do best? And which area will you and your colleagues work on tomorrow? I always like to take something away. So, you know, if you implement something tomorrow, what's it going to be? What are you going to take from this? So just have a ponder on that as you move off into the rest of your day, whatever time of day that might be. Thank you for hanging in there on this one. I know it's gone a bit longer than an hour, so I do apologise, but I hope that's been okay. Good luck in your work, and hopefully we will see you at another webinar, and hopefully we'll see you at a network soon. But take care of yourselves. Good luck with it all, and yeah, see you soon. Take care. Bye.